I have widened my lens and had a better sort of changing my perspective in the sense that there is systemic racism in the RCMP.
So Canada's top cop finally admitted systemic racism exists in the RCMP after previously denying it in a series of national media interviews. But when grilled by members of the House Safety Committee this week, RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki struggled to give an example of what systemic racism actually looks like. Instead, in a stunning moment, she compared systemic racism to a mandatory fitness test being easier for taller participants. She was immediately corrected by Quebec Liberal MP Greg Fergus, who also chairs Parliament's Black Caucus, who pointed out she might be referring to systemic discrimination but not systemic racism. Lucki then deferred to another member to provide an example. That has led to calls for Lucki to be removed from her post, that she's not the person who can lead the changes needed in her force. To talk about that and for calls for widespread police reform, including calls to defund the forces like the RCMP, Greg Fergus joins us now, the Liberal MP who was at the heart of this thing. Mr. Fergus, first of all, thank you. Hope you and the family are well. When RCMP Commissioner Lucki, who was prepared for that committee meeting for your questions, she'd already had to backtrack once on the issue of systemic racism, gave you that example of the broad jump. What did you think?
Well, I didn't know what to think at first. I wasn't certain where she was going to be going with this. And then it sort of dawned on me that either she didn't understand the question or she was giving an example of systemic discrimination. And that where I wanted to go with this was for her to give an example and to talk about what would be her definition of systemic racism.
Right. But she'd already struggled with that the week before in a series of interviews. Then you asked her for an example. She blew it. Then you said, okay, can you give us a better example? And in the next moment, she threw it over to her colleague, in other words, saying, I guess I don't really know. Does that reveal to you that she still, after all this time, does not understand what systemic racism is?
I think what it really points out to, Evan, is that this is a tough issue. This is a tough nut to crack. When you talk about unconscious bias, when you really don't want to admit that it exists, or if you have a sort of a cloudy definition of what it means, it's hard for you to then start really thinking the way that people who would be victims of systemic racism or systemic discrimination, how easily they would see it. It's hard for you to see it when you're not the one facing it. So what it really points out is that this is a tough issue. And we're seeing systemic racism in our police forces. We're seeing it in all our institutions across Canada. We're seeing it in politics. We're seeing it in the media. We're seeing it all over. And it's an issue which Canadians are struggling with now and figuring out how we're going to get to it. I don't think Commissioner Lucki is any different from many people who are just beginning to wrap their minds around this issue.
But she's the head of Canada's National Police Force. She was appointed 2 years ago. Her job is actually to root this out. Now you've admitted she doesn't really understand this any better than the average person, and yet she's supposed to lead a transformation. Do you still have faith, after all that she's done, that she can lead the RCMP, or should she be removed and let someone else who clearly has a deeper understanding of this issue take charge?
Well, that's a tough question to answer, and the reason why, Evan, I'm reluctant to call for her resignation is because if you have to allow people to learn, to grow. If she were to come back to the committee again and still struggle with the issue, I think then I would probably have trouble having confidence in her ability to root it out. But she always did admit that there was unconscious bias. She, I think, should have been better prepared for that question. I didn't think it was an unfair question to ask. But maybe from this, and I'm quite confident that she and her the senior leadership are all realizing, okay, how do we get our heads around this? Who do we call in? What type of, who do we speak to within our own forces? Who do we bring in from the outside to really get at this? I'm going to give her a chance to really, it's like when you fall off a bike and scrape your knee, you figure out how to do things better, at least not to repeat the same mistakes in the past. And this might give her an opportunity to really make effective changes in the RCMP.
So, some are pretty frustrated, not just because it's her words, but let's just look at the action.
It's tough.
The RCMP looked at the tape, the use of force on Chief Alan Adam in March. They initially thought it was justified. When it was made public, the charges were dropped. This is a commissioner who did not reveal that one of the officers involved in that case, Constable Simon Seguin, was already facing charges of assault and was subjected to an internal discipline process, not made public. This is a commissioner who, when asked by you, did not cite the missing and murdered Aboriginal women and girls file as a case of systemic racism, did not cite the stat about 36% of deaths at the hands of RCMP Indigenous people. With all those things, why? I'm just wondering, and I appreciate your generous interpretation, your hope that she changes, but when Indigenous people in Canada are more than 10 times likely to be shot and killed by a police officer since 2017 than a white person, why have faith for her learning curve, and why not the fierce urgency of the now to make a change?
Please don't mistake my generosity with not believing in the fierce urgency of now. This is the reason why we pushed out as a parliamentary Black caucus a very clear roadmap of actions which we need to take now. And part of that deals with justice, part of that deals with policing. Please don't interpret that at all as being soft on that issue. I'm very hard on the issue. But the point is that this is systemic discrimination, and I hate to tell you, Evan, a lot of people are guilty of it. And if I keep on tossing out everybody who doesn't step up to the standards that I would like to see, there's going to be very few people to work with. So I got to work with what I have. I got to help try to change minds, shape opinions. I have to invite people to be part of the conversation, as opposed to just tossing out anybody who doesn't meet the standard of excellence that I would set. This is the cruel aspect of being a Black Canadian or a person of color or an Indigenous person. We have to be patient. And we have to work with what we have. And let's try to change minds. And the best way to do that is to work with it and to get people into that spot. And if we see an unwillingness for people to get on board, then we have a problem.
And, sir, no one's questioning your understanding of this, much deeper than mine. And I absolutely know your commitment and deep understanding of this, sir. I appreciate your time, Mr. Fergus.
I don't take it that way at all.
No. Hey, but it's a fair point, and I appreciate it very much. Mr. Fergus, thank you so much for your time and your perspective. I appreciate it very much.
You're very welcome.